Welcome back. Now, here's something you might have missed. One of the best bits of analysis out of this campaign from Greg Sheridan in The Australian. It was there over the weekend. Sheridan looked closely at what he called the great unravelling, the collapse, he said, of traditional party structures across the democratic Western world. As the rich have got richer, they've gone woke. That's his upshot. And rather than lift the poor out of poverty, they're hell-bent on green virtue signalling. It's only going to make the poor's struggle economically harder. Joining me now for their take, Sky News host, former Liberal Senator Cory Bernardi, and co-host of Outsiders, the Daily Telegraph's political editor, James Morrow. Well, Boris Johnson had his red wall in Britain in the once very strongly Labor North. We're seeing what's happened in the Republican states in the United States. And of course, last weekend, we had this same sort of reckoning here in Australia about this demographic shift, Cory.
Well, Peter, I think Greg Sheridan's onto something, quite frankly. We've got a Liberal Party that is now trying to preach to the inner city and woke hipsters, and the people who have successfully previously put them into government, the Howard Battlers, the Tony's tradies, the blue-collar workers who feel abandoned by Labor, have been left with virtually nowhere to go. This is an existential crisis, I think, for centre-right parties. And the lesson is that if you go woke, you go broke. That happens in business and I think in politics as well. If you chase the left down the leftist rabbit hole, you'll end up with absolutely nothing, because they might say good on you, but they won't vote for you. And so the Liberal Party, I think, needs to reassess where it's pitching its market, just as the Republicans have, Peter.
I 100% agree with you, but I worry, James, that you know, kids coming through schools and you know, the university sector, parents scared, parents that might be agreeing, you know, there might be centre-right voters, but too scared to tackle the kids and say, well, you're not right, you're wrong. There's no debate in homes much anymore. People are scared of being shouted about, and the fact that the rich are getting richer and they don't care, that they're insulated from all of these issues.
Well, look, there's an awful lot of things to unpack here. I thought Greg Sheridan's commentary was pretty much spot on the money, as you said. What I think is really interesting here is we're seeing a couple of things. Number one, the rise of a kind of a left-wing populism, and I think you see that very clearly with the Teals, a posh, I call them the Puritans with the Proseccos out there in those Teal seats out there, who have a very sort of populist outlook on things, but it's the type of populism that the media approves of, so they don't get called on it, but it's the same sort of colored movement you get around a Trump rally, except it's teal T-shirts. But the other thing, too, there are glimmers of hope in this. I was speaking to Melissa McIntosh earlier, who won the seat of Lindsay with a 1.4% swing to the Liberals on Saturday night. And, you know, this was in Western Sydney. She's very clear that Western Sydney is where it's at for the Liberals, that you know, all of these families, aspirational families, the heart of the Menzies idea and tradition, you know, really doesn't sit in those blue ribbon seats anymore. It sits out there, and there's a real proof point in how she ran a campaign that was very hyper-local, very much about bringing home things that they needed, but getting the government out of people's lives at the same time. You know, that is a real lesson, I think, and getting involved in these fights about, you know, are we too moderate, are we too conservative? Voters are going to switch off, and they're going to keep the Liberals in the wilderness for as long as it looks like people are looking down into their own navel on this stuff.
Yeah, Jason Wood, in the same sort of vein in Victoria, in the outer reaches of Melbourne, a bit like Lindsay, he also got a swing to him. And I agree with you. I said at the top of the show, it's not so much left and right. It's the Liberals have drifted to the left, over across to the centre. They need to just remember who they are. They need to go back to first principles. One of those, Cory, debt. We've talked about this so many times. It was not even acknowledged in the campaign. I feel like the Liberal Party has junked one of its great sort of credentials. Jim Chalmers today, the new Treasurer, was banging on about it. Very careful to say that, you know, we've inherited this mess from the Liberal Party, so they'll dine out on that for the next 3 years and blame everything on what they've got. But we know around the world, we've got debt and inflation in particular, a real issue. I reckon we're facing some dark times ahead.
Oh, Peter, we certainly are, and it's because every dollar that they now inject into the economy, it has a diminishing effect. And so the Labor Party have really nowhere to go, quite frankly. They will dine out on the $1 trillion worth of debt. It's $1.2 trillion it will be in the forward estimates. and it's not their fault. And this is why, I think the Liberals copped the shellacking. They've given up on the key principles. But looking forward, you've got a number of competing forces. You've got inflation, you do have a globally stagnant economy, supply chain crises, you've got people who don't want to work, you've got increasing numbers of people who are dependent on welfare and government largesse, and governments love that sort of stuff, quite frankly, because it allows you to control individuals. It's not a good-looking outlook. I think stagflation has been mentioned, and you just have to remind yourself of how bad and debilitating that was in the 70s. And we want to avoid that at all costs, quite frankly, Peter.
James, let's go to the shooting in the United States. We have this news breakout all the time about mass shootings. Horrifically, this involved little children killed by someone not long out of school themselves. President Biden gave a very sort of emotional speech today as soon as he got back from Tokyo. I reckon I counted 16, 17 references to God, but God's not going to save him here. We know in Australia in '96 it's all about political leadership. Even if he's got the will, he's got issues with Congress and he's got that constitutional Bill of Rights impediment, but how on earth does the US turn this around?
Excuse me. I don't really know. This is a problem that presidents both left and right have tried to grapple with for decades now. You've got the Second Amendment problem, but also you've got the problem that there are 400 million guns out there in the American community. And how do you buy them back? You can't do what John Howard did. That's simply physically not possible. And also, the great majority of murders and homicides, manslaughters in the U.S., they're by handguns, and that's not reported. Chicago, Baltimore, New York, all of these places, on a weekly basis, you have these sorts of numbers being racked up every single week, and yet there's no political will to do anything about that either. So I think that with things like these mass shootings, a lot of it is mental health. I think a lot of it is issues like that. I think that there's something quite wrong at the moment with, just the American psyche. It's a very neurotic place at the moment. I don't know how you begin to fix all of these things, but sweet words from Joe Biden, that's not going to do it. And just recycling the old talking points about guns, that's not going to do it either. There needs to be something completely different, entire shift change on this issue.
We've got a crisis in mental health, Cory, in the Western world. The video games that young people love, they are hyper real these days. They're not the Space Invaders or the Pac-Mans of my era. They are literally like a virtual world. Any one of these kids are almost doing military-style training as teenagers. They can get their hands on assault weapons, stuff that most of the military in Australia wouldn't even get to train with. And then they walk into these schools or the malls and cinemas and do their worst.
Well, Peter, you're right about the hyper-realism. I mean, let's not pretend that our own special forces and military don't train with video simulations. They do all the time, for marksmanship in particular. And so these things, I mean, the more you're exposed to violence, the more desensitised you get to it. And it's one big problem. And then when you couple that with mental health issues, which are often caused by substance abuse, and we've got substances that do cause mental health issues, and you've got politicians who are saying we should decriminalise and get more people on them. I think that's a big problem. We don't have the same treatment facilities. There's a whole range of areas of resilience. We don't encourage kids to do sport. All of these things contribute to how people perceive themselves. And plus, you've got the hyper-partisan political environment in which people say things that often encourage others down very, very dark paths. And my heart goes out to everyone involved in this or who's affected by it, because it is just beyond, it's immeasurable beyond words. And I don't have a solution to it, Peter, but it's a global problem, how we're dealing with people with mental health issues that want to go down these radical paths.
Yeah, I think this is a trend for the future, not necessarily guns here in Australia, but just a lost generation of young people. James and Cory, thank you for your time.